London, September 1940. The sun has just slipped beyond the horizon, leaving behind an orange haze that fades into black. People hurry into underground stations, clutching their children, their eyes heavy with fear. Somewhere above them, a low, distant rumble grows louder, a sound that Britain will come to know too well. It is the beginning of the Blitz. For months, Britain had stood alone against Hitler's unstoppable war machine. France had fallen. Europe was burning. Now, the Nazi warlord turned his fury toward the last bastion of resistance, the United Kingdom. His goal was clear: crush British morale, destroy their cities, and force surrender through fire and terror from the skies. At precisely 4:43 p.m. on September 7, 1940, the first wave of German bombers, nearly 350 aircraft, crossed the English Channel. Their target, the beating heart of Britain, London. As the air raid sirens wailed, thousands ran for shelter. Anti-aircraft guns thundered, spitting fiery arcs into the night. But the bombers came in waves, unstoppable. Mechanical shadows blotting out the moon. Explosions ripped through the docklands, warehouses, and homes. The city lit up in flames, a sea of red against the black sky. A reporter that night wrote, "The whole of London seemed on fire. The sky was crimson. The river was glowing." The attack lasted for hours. By dawn, more than 400 civilians lay dead. Yet this was only the beginning. The Blitz would continue for 57 consecutive nights, burning London, Coventry, and countless towns across Britain. Still, amid the ashes, something unbreakable began to rise: the spirit of the British people. Firemen battled through collapsing buildings. Rescue workers pulled survivors from rubble. And ordinary citizens refused to give in. From underground tunnels, families sang songs to drown out the bombs. Children clutched their gas masks like toys. And soldiers vowed that the Nazis would never see the Union Jack lowered. Prime Minister Winston Churchill would soon address the nation with words that became immortal: "We shall never surrender." As the smoke cleared that morning, Londoners emerged from the ruins tired, bloodied, but unbroken. They would bury their dead, rebuild their homes, and prepare for another night of terror. The Blitz had begun, but Britain would endure. September 1940. Across the English Channel, in occupied France, airfields buzzed with deadly precision. The Luftwaffe, the pride of Hitler's military machine, was preparing for a campaign of total destruction. Their mission was not just military, it was psychological. Hitler wanted to break Britain's will to fight. If the British people could be crushed under fire and fear, the government would have no choice but to surrender. At first, the Luftwaffe's main targets were military airfields, radar stations, and factories vital to Britain's defense. But after a British raid on Berlin, Hitler's fury turned personal. The Nazi leader vowed revenge. Civilian cities became the new battleground. London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, all would burn. Every night, the German bombers came like a storm. They flew in vast formations: Heinkel, he 111 seconds, Dornier Ju 17 seconds, and Junkers Ju 88s, escorted by Messerschmitt fighters. Their engines roared through the dark skies, a sound that became the soundtrack of fear. British radar operators detected them, sending urgent warnings to anti-aircraft defenses. Sirens wailed across the countryside. In moments, whole cities went dark. Streetlights vanished, windows were blacked out, and people fled into cellars or underground stations. Then, the night would erupt in chaos. High explosive bombs shattered streets and tore through homes. Incendiary devices rained down, igniting fires that merged into firestorms. Entire blocks burned for hours while rescue teams worked tirelessly through smoke and rubble. But even as the bombs fell, Britain fought back. The Royal Air Force, though battered from the Battle of Britain, rose again to meet the attackers. Searchlights sliced through the night, locking onto enemy bombers. Anti-aircraft guns thundered from rooftops and parks. RAF night fighters, guided by radar, began to stalk the raiders through the clouds. Still, the Luftwaffe's power seemed endless. Day after day, night after night, they came. Londoners called it the nightly visit. There was no rest, no safety, only courage. In one of his wartime broadcasts, Winston Churchill reminded the nation, "Let us so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour." Those words became a beacon in the darkness. In shelters and subway tunnels, families clung to hope. The British spirit, tested, scarred, and tired, refused to bow to tyranny. The Luftwaffe believed Britain would crumble within weeks, but what they didn't understand was that you can destroy buildings, but not courage. You can burn cities, but not faith. And as the fires of London glowed red against the sky, Hitler's plan to terrorize a nation began to falter. The Blitz was supposed to break Britain. Instead, it began to unite it. September 1940. Across the English Channel, in occupied France, airfields buzzed with deadly precision. The Luftwaffe, the pride of Hitler's military machine, was preparing for a campaign of total destruction. Their mission was not just military, it was psychological. Hitler wanted to break Britain's will to fight. If the British people could be crushed under fire and fear, the government would have no choice but to surrender. At first, the Luftwaffe's main targets were military airfields, radar stations, and factories vital to Britain's defense. But after a British raid on Berlin, Hitler's fury turned personal. The Nazi leader vowed revenge. Civilian cities became the new battleground. London, Coventry, Birmingham, Liverpool, all would burn. Every night, the German bombers came like a storm. They flew in vast formations. Heinkel, he 111 seconds, Dornier do 17 seconds, and Junkers Ju 88s, escorted by Messerschmitt fighters. Their engines roared through the dark skies, a sound that became the soundtrack of fear. British radar operators detected them, sending urgent warnings to anti-aircraft defenses. Sirens wailed across the countryside. In moments, whole cities went dark. Streetlights vanished, windows were blacked out, and people fled into cellars or underground stations. Then, the night would erupt in chaos. High explosive bombs shattered streets and tore through homes. Incendiary devices rained down, igniting fires that merged into firestorms. Entire blocks burned for hours while rescue teams worked tirelessly through smoke and rubble. But even as the bombs fell, Britain fought back. The Royal Air Force, though, battered from the Battle of Britain, rose again to meet the attackers. Searchlights sliced through the night, locking onto enemy bombers. Anti-aircraft guns thundered from rooftops and parks. RAF night fighters, guided by radar, began to stalk the raiders through the clouds. Still, the Luftwaffe's power seemed endless. Day after day, night after night, they came. Londoners called it the nightly visit. There was no rest, no safety, only courage. In one of his wartime broadcasts, Winston Churchill reminded the nation, "Let us so bear ourselves that if the British Empire and its Commonwealth last for 1,000 years, men will still say, this was their finest hour." Those words became a beacon in the darkness. In shelters and subway tunnels, families clung to hope. The British spirit, tested, scarred, and tired, refused to bow to tyranny. The Luftwaffe believed Britain would crumble within weeks, but what they didn't understand was that you can destroy buildings, but not courage. You can burn cities, but not faith. And as the fires of London glowed red against the sky, Hitler's plan to terrorize a nation began to falter. The Blitz was supposed to break Britain. Instead, it began to unite it. December 29, 1940, a freezing winter night. The wind howled through the ruins of London, carrying the smell of smoke and ash. For weeks, the capital had been battered by wave after wave of Luftwaffe raids. But on this night, Britain would face one of the most devastating attacks of the entire Blitz. At precisely 6:15 p.m., the first German bombers appeared through the clouds. They were not carrying high explosives this time, they carried incendiary bombs, thousands of them, designed to ignite anything they touched. Within minutes, the ancient city was burning. The area around St. Paul's Cathedral, the City of London, and the docks became an inferno. Streets glowed orange, smoke billowed skyward, and buildings that had stood for centuries crumbled into ashes. Eyewitnesses later called it the Second Great Fire of London. Firefighters, many of them volunteers, worked tirelessly, often surrounded by collapsing walls and unexploded bombs. Water hoses froze in the bitter cold, yet they fought on, passing buckets hand to hand, desperate to stop the flames from consuming the city's soul. Amid the chaos, one structure stood defiant. St. Paul's Cathedral, covered in smoke and surrounded by fire, the great dome seemed doomed. But through sheer determination and bravery, firemen formed human chains, protecting it from the flames. Against all odds, St. Paul survived the night, rising through the smoke as a symbol of endurance. The next morning, a photograph taken from the rooftops showed St. Paul standing tall amid a sea of destruction. That image became an instant legend, a sign that even when London burned, its spirit would not be destroyed. But the cost was immense. Over 1,500 fires raged across the city. Whole streets vanished. Tens of thousands were left homeless. Yet, when dawn broke, the Union Jack still flew above the ruins. One fire warden wrote in his diary that night, "It was as if hell had opened above us, but we did not yield." Despite the devastation, Londoners carried on. Offices reopened the next day. Mail was delivered. The bells of St. Paul's rang once more. The German High Command believed that such destruction would break morale. Instead, it hardened it. The sight of that dome rising through smoke told the world something powerful. Britain might be on its knees, but it would never fall. That night, as the embers cooled and the sky turned gray, the people of London looked upon their shattered streets and whispered the same promise: "We will rebuild. We will fight on." The flames had failed to destroy their faith. If anything, the fire only made it stronger. By early 1941, the war above Britain's skies had changed. What began as a campaign of terror was now turning into a battle of endurance and skill. The Luftwaffe still roared over London and the industrial cities, but Britain was learning, adapting, fighting back harder than ever before. Every night, British searchlights swept the clouds, their beams converging like ghostly swords. Anti-aircraft batteries thundered from rooftops, bridges, and parks. And high above, the Royal Air Force prepared to strike back. The RAF had already proven its strength in the Battle of Britain, when young pilots, many barely in their 20s, stood against the full might of Hitler's air armada. Now, those same airmen faced the challenge of night warfare. Radar, still a new technology, became Britain's invisible weapon. Hidden in dark countryside stations, operators listened intently, tracking bombers miles before they reached London. Guided by these signals, RAF night fighters took to the skies, Beaufighters, mosquitoes, and hurricanes hunting their prey through the black clouds. It was a dangerous, almost impossible job. The darkness made identification nearly suicidal. Pilots often saw only fleeting shadows or the glow of an enemy's engine, yet they flew on every night because the city below depended on them. One pilot, Flight Lieutenant John Cunningham, became famous as Cat's Eyes for his incredible night vision. He and others brought down dozens of bombers, saving countless lives on the ground. Slowly, the tide began to shift. German losses mounted. Their raids became less effective, their formations less confident. British defenses were growing sharper, faster, more coordinated. And while the RAF fought above, British engineers worked tirelessly on the ground, developing faster interceptors, more accurate anti-aircraft guns, and better communication systems. The coordination between the air and ground forces turned chaos into strategy. For the first time, the British public began to believe that victory in the air was possible. Newspapers carried headlines like, "Our boys hit back," and "Luftwaffe loses heavy over London." But it wasn't just technology or tactics that turned the tide, it was spirit. The same courage that kept Londoners singing in the shelters now fueled the men who flew into darkness every night. In one of his wartime addresses, Churchill praised the RAF with words that echoed through history. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. Those few became heroes not for their strength, but for their unyielding courage. And as the months passed, the Luftwaffe began to realize what Hitler had refused to admit: Britain could not be broken. The Blitz had burned Britain's cities, but it had forged something stronger than steel: a nation's resolve. The industrial city of Coventry was quiet, its people unaware that by dawn, their home would be reduced to ashes. High above the dark countryside, the German Luftwaffe was gathering in force more than 500 bombers, loaded with high explosives and incendiaries. Their target was not just a military one, it was symbolic. Coventry, known for its factories and engineering plants, was the beating heart of Britain's wartime production. Destroying it would cripple morale and industry in a single night. As the air raid siren screamed, the city's residents rushed for cover. Anti-aircraft guns fired into the darkness, but the bombers came in relentless waves. The first explosions ripped through the industrial district, followed by a rain of incendiaries that set fire to homes, churches, and hospitals. Within an hour, Coventry was burning. Eyewitnesses described the city as a ring of fire. The streets glowed red, buildings collapsed into rubble, and a storm of sparks and smoke filled the night sky. Firefighters battled heroically, but the water mains had been destroyed by bombs. Hoses ran dry as flames devoured everything in sight. In the city center stood Coventry Cathedral, a towering symbol of faith. When incendiary bombs struck its roof, volunteers formed human chains to save it, but the flames were too fierce. The great spire glowed against the inferno before collapsing into ruin. When the sun rose the next morning, Coventry was unrecognizable. More than 500 people were dead. 4,000 homes lay in ruins. The city's heart had been torn out, but amid the devastation, something powerful happened. Standing in the ruins of the cathedral, residents gathered not in despair, but in defiance. A local priest placed 2 charred beams in the shape of a cross over the rubble. He called it the Cross of Nails. It became a lasting symbol of forgiveness and resilience, a message to the world that even in destruction, humanity could endure. The word Coventrated was soon coined by the Germans themselves to describe the total annihilation of a city. But what they didn't understand was that Coventry's destruction did not weaken Britain, it strengthened its resolve. Factories were rebuilt, production continued, refugees from other cities arrived to help. The flames that had turned Coventry to ash also lit the fire of unity across Britain. When Churchill visited the ruins, he said quietly, "These ruins will one day stand as a monument to British courage." And he was right. The bombing of Coventry became one of the darkest nights of the Blitz, but from its ashes rose a message that echoed across the empire: "You can destroy our cities, but not our soul." Amid the ruins and fire, the true strength of Britain revealed itself not in weapons or machines, but in ordinary people who refused to break. Every street, every home, every shelter had its heroes. Men and women who rose each night to face chaos and death, not because they were soldiers, but because they were needed. The firefighters, working through endless nights, became the unsung warriors of the Blitz. Clad in steel helmets, armed only with hoses and courage, they raced toward burning buildings while bombs still fell around them. Many never returned, but their comrades kept going, driven by duty, by the hope that one more life could be saved. Then there were the air raid precaution ARP, wardens, volunteers who patrolled the darkened streets, shouting, "Put that light out," to prevent enemy aircraft from spotting their targets. They guided the lost to shelters, carried the wounded to safety, and comforted the terrified during the longest nights. The rescue teams, the ambulance drivers, the nurses, they too faced unimaginable horror. Hospitals overflowed with casualties. Streets were choked with rubble. Yet, through exhaustion and heartbreak, they worked on, patching wounds and saving lives with whatever they had. And behind them all were the ordinary citizens, mothers who turned air raid shelters into makeshift nurseries, shopkeepers who opened their stores among ruins, teachers who held classes in bombed-out basements. They were not fighting with guns, but with faith. One photograph from 1941 shows a milkman calmly delivering bottles along a street lined with debris, smoke still rising in the distance. That single image captured the essence of wartime Britain, defiance in the face of despair. Radio broadcasts carried messages of courage. The BBC aired nightly updates that reminded people they were not alone. Music filled the airwaves. Songs like "We'll Meet Again" by Vera Lynn brought comfort to millions, becoming the anthem of endurance. Even children played their part. Many were evacuated to the countryside, separated from their families, Yet they wrote letters filled with bravery and longing. Others remained in the cities, helping as messengers and volunteers, their innocence shaped by war. And through it all, Winston Churchill's voice echoed across the nation gravelly, powerful, unshaken. His speeches became more than words. They were weapons against fear. Courage is rightly esteemed the first of human qualities, because it has been said, it is the quality which guarantees all others. These were not soldiers in uniform, but the backbone of Britain's survival. While bombs shattered walls and burned skies, the British people built something indestructible: the belief that freedom was worth any sacrifice. The world watched as London burned, but what it saw shining through the flames was the unbreakable spirit of a nation. War spares no one but for the children of the Blitz. It was a world where innocence met terror. When the air raid sirens wailed, little feet would run down dark stairways, clutching dolls, teddy bears, or a single suitcase. Some were so young, they didn't yet understand what the sirens meant, only that it was time to hide. Across Britain, millions of children were evacuated from the cities to the countryside. In an operation known as Operation Pied Piper, small hands waved goodbye from train windows as mothers tried to smile through their tears. They were promised safety, but what they felt most was confusion and loneliness. Those who stayed behind faced nights of fear beneath the thunder of falling bombs. In the underground shelters, children slept on narrow benches, often still wearing their gas masks. Parents whispered stories to keep them calm, trying to drown out the distant explosions above. Yet, even amid the horror, childhood found a way to survive. In the mornings, after the all-clear siren sounded, children would climb out of the shelters and play in the rubble-strewn streets. A burned-out car became a fortress. A crater turned into a playground. Their laughter was faint, but it echoed like hope through the smoke. Teachers became soldiers of the spirit, holding classes in church basements and railway tunnels. Lessons were written on chalkboards propped against sandbags. Every word taught was an act of defiance, a reminder that learning and light still mattered in a darkened world. Many children wrote letters to their fathers fighting overseas. "Dear Daddy, I miss you. The house next door was hit last night, but we are safe. Mummy says we will win." Those words, simple and pure, became a reflection of Britain's heart. But not all stories had happy endings. Thousands of children lost their homes and some, their families. The Blitz carved deep scars into a generation that grew up too fast, their dreams shaped by the sound of sirens and the smell of smoke. Still, even they found courage. A young evacuee named Elsie Turner, only 9 years old, once said, "We didn't cry. We were brave for Mum. Everyone was brave." The resilience of these children reminded the world that courage is not measured in strength, but in endurance, the quiet kind. The kind that keeps going even when the world seems to end each night. When peace finally came, many of those children would look back on the Blitz not with hatred, but with pride. They had lived through fire and fear, and still learned how to hope. For in the smallest hearts, Britain's greatest courage was found. By the spring of 1941, the firestorm over Britain began to fade. For nearly 9 relentless months, the Luftwaffe had bombed cities, ports, and factories. Tens of thousands were dead, millions homeless, and whole neighborhoods reduced to ashes. Yet, Britain still stood. The German High Command had expected surrender within weeks. Instead, they faced a nation that refused to bow. The Royal Air Force had grown stronger, its pilots more skilled, its radar more advanced. The Luftwaffe, once feared as invincible, was bleeding. Every night, British defenses grew sharper. Anti-aircraft crews learned to predict flight patterns, and the newly developed chain-home radar system gave precious minutes of warning before raids. What began as chaos was now a deadly dance, and Britain was learning the steps. The German bombers kept coming, but they no longer owned the skies. Losses mounted. Crews failed to return. Many aircraft were shot down over the channel, their burning wreckage lighting up the night sea. Meanwhile, British industries refused to collapse. Factories damaged by bombs were repaired within days. Workers labored through nights, sometimes by candlelight, producing the very weapons that would one day turn the tide of war. And deep beneath the city, the people of London endured. The shelters had become communities complete with libraries, concerts, even weddings held underground. Life went on, defiantly, under the threat of death. By May 1941, the Luftwaffe launched its final, desperate assault on London. For 2 nights, the bombs fell harder than ever. Fires raged across the capital, lighting up the Thames like molten gold. But when the dawn came, the city still breathed. The people of Britain had endured 57 consecutive nights of bombing, followed by countless raids across the country. They had lost everything, except their spirit, and that spirit had become indestructible. Soon after, Hitler turned his eyes eastward, toward a new target, the Soviet Union. The Blitz was over. London's skies grew quiet for the first time in months. But the silence was not victory, it was survival. The scars remained, bombed-out streets, shattered homes, and families forever changed. Yet through those scars, a nation rediscovered its strength. A reporter for The Times wrote, "We have been tested by fire, and we have not been found wanting." The Blitz had failed in its mission. It had not destroyed Britain, it had defined it. As Londoners emerged from the ruins that summer, they knew the war was far from over, but they had proven to themselves, and to the world, that no bomb, no fear, no tyrant could break the heart of a free people. Britain had endured its darkest hour, and from that darkness, a new light began to rise. In the summer of 1941, when the last echoes of the Blitz faded from Britain's skies, the scale of the devastation was revealed. Cities once filled with laughter now stood silent, streets torn apart, homes reduced to dust, cathedrals shattered, factories burned. More than 43,000 civilians had lost their lives. Over 1 million homes were destroyed. Every family had a story of loss, yet every story also carried a spark of survival. Across the nation, people began the slow, painful work of rebuilding. Men returned from the shelters to find their neighborhoods gone. Women gathered bricks from the rubble, stacking them neatly for reconstruction. Children played among the ruins, their laughter echoing against broken walls. Britain's strength was not in its buildings, it was in its people. In London, small shops reopened beside craters where entire blocks had stood. Churches held services amid ruins. Even in the shadow of destruction, life found its way back. The smell of smoke was replaced, slowly, by the sound of hammers, saws, and determination. Government programs were launched to rebuild the housing and industry destroyed by bombs. Architects envisioned new cities stronger, more modern, and filled with light. From tragedy, a new vision of Britain began to emerge. Yet, the emotional scars ran deep. The Blitz had changed the British people forever. They had learned resilience, but also sacrifice. They had seen the worst of war and the best of humanity. Winston Churchill addressed the nation once more, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "Out of the ruins, out of the dust and the blood, we shall build again. This will not be the end of Britain, but her rebirth." And so it was. Through hardship, the British people forged something unbreakable, a unity that transcended fear. Communities that had huddled together in the underground remained bound by friendship and trust. The spirit of "we're all in this together" became the foundation of post-war Britain. The Blitz had been intended to divide, to destroy, to conquer. Instead, it had united a nation like never before. When victory finally came in 1945, the memories of the Blitz still haunted the survivors, but they also stood as proof of what humanity could endure. The ruins of Coventry Cathedral were preserved as a memorial, its charred cross still standing among the stones. It became a message to the world not of revenge, but of reconciliation. The fires of war had turned cities to ash, but from that ash rose something far greater: hope. For the people of Britain, the Blitz was not just a tragedy, it was a testament, a reminder that even in the darkest night, the human spirit can still burn brighter than the fire that tries to destroy it. When the night seemed endless and the flames rose high, one voice stood tall above the chaos: Winston Churchill. He was more than a prime minister, he was the heartbeat of a defiant nation. In 1940 and 1941, while bombs rained over Britain, Churchill's words carried the power to lift millions from despair. His speeches were not merely politics, they were weapons of courage. In every broadcast, his gravelly voice echoed through radios, reaching homes, shelters, hospitals, and trenches. People huddled in darkness would turn up the volume, listening to his unshakable tone. It gave them something the Luftwaffe could never destroy: hope. We shall not flag or fail. We shall go on to the end. We shall fight in France. We shall fight on the seas and oceans. We shall never surrender. Those words became a battle cry, not for soldiers alone, but for every man, woman, and child enduring the Blitz. Even as London burned, Churchill visited the smoldering ruins himself. He walked through the debris, his face set with determination. When he met survivors, he didn't just offer words, he offered presence. His cigar glowed faintly in the haze of smoke, a symbol of defiance. He looked at the wreckage and said softly, "We can take it." That simple phrase became the spirit of the people, a rallying call that Britain would not be broken. Behind closed doors, Churchill carried the unbearable weight of leadership. Every night, reports of bombings crossed his desk, lists of the dead, the missing, the wounded. Yet in public, he never allowed despair to show. He knew that the strength of the nation flowed through its morale. Churchill once told his cabinet, "You ask, what is our aim? I can answer in one word: victory. Victory at all costs." He understood that victory began in the heart long before it was won on the battlefield. His leadership transformed fear into fire. When the Luftwaffe intensified its attacks, Churchill doubled down on air defense. He praised the RAF, calling them the few, whose bravery in the skies would save countless lives below. Never in the field of human conflict was so much owed by so many to so few. These words immortalized the pilots, who risked everything. During the Battle of Britain, they were the shield that allowed London to endure. By the end of the Blitz, Churchill had become a symbol of unbreakable faith. To his people, he was more than a leader. He was the embodiment of British grit. The enemy sought to silence Britain through terror, but with every speech, Churchill's voice thundered louder than the bombs. Through his words, a nation rediscovered its soul. While bombs fell from the heavens, another war was being fought on the ground, a battle against fire, chaos, and time itself. They were not soldiers. They carried no guns. Yet, they were among the bravest warriors of the Blitz. The firefighters and rescuers who risked everything to save others from the inferno. When the sirens wailed and the sky turned red, these men and women rushed toward the destruction that everyone else fled. Wearing heavy helmets, clutching hoses, axes, and courage, they entered blazing streets where buildings collapsed like paper. In London, Manchester, Coventry, and countless other cities, the auxiliary fire service AFs worked side by side with professional firefighters. They battled not just flames, but exhaustion, smoke, and falling debris. Night after night, they fought to keep their cities alive. The fires burned hotter than anything they had known. Thousands of degrees, fed by wooden homes, gas lines, and shattered factories. Streets became rivers of flame. The roar of collapsing roofs mixed with the whistle of incoming bombs. Many firefighters never came back. Entire crews vanished when a single high-explosive shell struck their engine. Yet others carried on, dragging hoses through rubble, spraying water over craters, shielding civilians from falling sparks. At times, the water ran out. Then they fought with sand, shovels, and bare hands. One survivor remembered, "You didn't think about danger, you just thought about the people screaming inside those buildings." Rescue workers, too, became legends. The air raid precautions ARP, wardens and civil defense volunteers worked tirelessly through the nights, pulling survivors from crushed basements, giving first aid under candlelight, guiding families through smoke-filled streets. The famous photograph of St. Paul's Cathedral, standing tall amid a sea of burning ruins, became a symbol of their heroism. Firefighters had fought desperately all night to save it, refusing to abandon their post even as bombs exploded around them. When dawn came, Londoners saw the cathedral still standing, blackened, but proud. To many, it was a miracle. Behind every image of survival during the Blitz, there was a firefighter or rescuer who made it possible. They received little glory, few medals, and no rest. Yet, they embodied the spirit of the nation. Courage without question, service without hesitation. As one fireman later said, "We didn't think of ourselves as heroes. We were just doing what had to be done." Their hands were burned, their lungs scarred, their memories haunted, but they never faltered. When Britain finally rose from the ruins, it did so on the shoulders of those who had stood in the fire. In the heart of war, amid sirens and smoke, the softest voices were often the bravest. The voices of the children of the Blitz. They were too young to understand politics, yet old enough to feel fear. The war came to them not as headlines, but as the sound of breaking glass, the thunder of bombs, and the glow of fire beyond the curtains. When the air raid sirens screamed, children clutched their gas masks and ran, with their parents, toward the nearest shelter. In underground tunnels, basements, and railway stations, they waited in the darkness, listening, trembling, and hoping the next explosion wouldn't find them. For many, childhood ended too soon. Toys were replaced by rationed books, games were played in ruins, school lessons were interrupted by sirens. Yet, somehow, they still found laughter amid the chaos. One little girl later wrote in her diary, "We used to play spot the bomb crater on the way to school. It was scary, but we pretended it was an adventure." Across Britain, millions of children were evacuated from the cities, sent by train to the countryside, far from the danger zones. Tags around their necks, small suitcases in hand, they waved goodbye to their mothers through tear-streaked windows, not knowing if they would ever meet again. Some found comfort in the green hills and open skies of rural England. Others faced loneliness, fear, and homesickness. The countryside was safe, but it was not home. In the cities, those who stayed behind lived through nights of terror. Many children grew used to sleeping in shelters, the sound of bombs becoming as familiar as the ticking of a clock. They learned to be brave not because they wanted to, but because they had no choice. Teachers, nurses, and volunteers worked tirelessly to protect them, turning subway stations into schools by day and dormitories by night. In those dark tunnels, children sang songs to drown out the explosions above. Their voices became tiny beacons of hope in the blackness. One child survivor would later recall, "I remember my mother whispering stories to me while the bombs fell. I thought if she could still tell stories, everything would be all right." After the war, those children would grow up to rebuild the country their parents had defended. They carried the memories of fire and courage, fear and faith, and passed them on as lessons to future generations. The children of the Blitz were living proof that innocence can endure even the darkest storm. They had seen destruction, but they had also seen unity. They had felt fear, but they had also learned strength. In their eyes, we find the truest reflection of Britain's resilience. When the sky turned to fire, and the city above trembled, millions of lives found safety in the darkness below. During the Blitz, London's underground became more than a railway, it became a sanctuary, a city beneath the city. Every night, thousands of men, women, and children descended the stairways carrying blankets, pillows, and what little hope they had left. By dusk, the platforms were packed. Families lined up side by side, shoulder to shoulder. As the sound of bombs echoed overhead, some slept, some prayed, others just listened, counting the seconds between explosions. The air was thick with the smell of dust and candle smoke. Babies cried softly. Old radios whispered news bulletins. Volunteers handed out tea and biscuits to calm frightened souls. And in that underground world, strangers became family. It was not comfort, but it was safety. In Aldwych Station, entire tunnels were transformed into dormitories. In Liverpool Street, mothers sang lullabies to drown the rumble of warplanes. And at Piccadilly Circus, a small orchestra played softly in the corner, music against madness. Despite the fear, there was life in those shelters. People told jokes, shared stories, even celebrated birthdays. Children played with makeshift toys in the narrow walkways, pretending the distant explosions were thunder. One survivor later recalled, "We made friends down there. You'd talk to people you'd never have spoken to before. We all knew we were in this together." The government initially discouraged the use of underground stations as shelters, fearing panic and disorder, but the people decided otherwise. By sheer will, Londoners turned their subways into fortresses of resilience. When the bombs hit nearby, the tunnels shook like living things. Dust rained from the ceiling. The lights flickered, yet no one left. They held hands, whispered prayers, and waited for morning. Above ground, entire streets could vanish overnight. But below, beneath the chaos, life carried on stubbornly, defiantly. In time, the underground became a symbol of Britain's endurance. It represented not retreat, but resistance, the unyielding will to survive no matter the odds. When dawn arrived, people climbed back up the stairs into the light, brushing dust from their clothes, ready to face another day. Some returned to work, others searched for what was left of their homes, but all carried the same quiet pride. We made it through the night. The shelters of the Blitz were not just places of safety, they were proof that even in total darkness, humanity could still shine. Beneath the bombs, Britain had found its heart. The fires burned out, the sirens fell silent, and the dawn of victory finally broke across Britain's battered skyline. After nearly 8 months of relentless bombing from September 1940 to May 1941, the Blitz had ended. The Luftwaffe had failed to crush Britain's spirit. The people had endured every night of terror, every shattered home, every loss, and still stood tall beneath their tattered flags. Out of the ruins came resilience. Out of darkness came unity. Out of pain came purpose. When victory was declared in 1945, tears filled the streets of London. Tears not only for joy, but for remembrance. The cost of survival had been immense. 43,000 dead, 139,000 wounded, and cities forever changed. But the nation had proven that courage could outlast catastrophe. Winston Churchill stood before the crowds and spoke words that echoed across generations. "This is your victory. You endured the Blitz, you defended your island home, and you have shown the world that freedom cannot be bombed into surrender." From London to Coventry, from Liverpool to Bristol, the people rebuilt their homes and their lives. Bricks were stacked where bombs had fallen. Streets once covered in rubble became symbols of rebirth. The ruins of Coventry Cathedral were left standing, a scar, a memory, and a message of forgiveness. The Blitz was more than a chapter in war. It was a testament to human endurance. The courage of firefighters who ran into flames. The resolve of mothers who comforted their children in the dark. The steady voice of Churchill, and the laughter of children in shelters, all became part of Britain's soul. Even decades later, the stories live on in the quiet words of survivors, in museums filled with gas masks and helmets, in memorials that whisper of sacrifice. The Blitz taught the world that true strength lies not in weapons or walls, but in the will to stand together. The war would move on to the deserts of North Africa, to the beaches of Normandy, but the spirit forged in the Blitz would never fade. It became Britain's unshakable identity, calm in chaos, courage in fear, hope in ruin. Every time the clock strikes 9 in the evening and the lights of London glow across the Thames, they shine for those who kept the flame alive in the darkest hour. The Blitz was meant to break Britain, but instead, it built a nation that would never bow again. And as history remembers those nights of fire, one truth remains eternal. While London burned, the world watched in awe, in fear, and in admiration. The Blitz was not only a British tragedy, it was a turning point in world history. The courage shown by ordinary citizens under the relentless rain of bombs captured hearts across the globe. Newspapers from New York to New Delhi printed images of shattered streets and smiling survivors, calling it the spirit of Britain. Before the Blitz, many nations doubted that Britain could stand alone against Hitler's war machine. But as night after night, the Luftwaffe attacked and failed, the myth of Nazi invincibility began to crack. Britain's endurance became a symbol of defiance for all who resisted tyranny. In America, President Franklin D. Roosevelt watched closely. The images of bombed hospitals, burning churches, and unbroken Londoners moved him deeply. The bravery of the British people strengthened his resolve to aid them. Soon after, supplies, weapons, and food began to cross the Atlantic under the Lend-Lease program, giving Britain the means to fight on. Radio broadcasts from the BBC carried the voices of British citizens to the world. Listeners heard the steady heartbeat, of a nation under fire, the calm words of Churchill, the laughter of children in shelters, and the promise that Britain would never surrender. The Blitz united the Allied cause long before armies met on the battlefield. It reminded nations everywhere that freedom was worth defending no matter the cost. Even neutral countries felt its impact. In Sweden and Switzerland, citizens collected money for British relief efforts. In Canada, Australia, and New Zealand, volunteers enlisted, inspired by the stories of London's survival. But perhaps the most powerful effect was psychological. The Blitz showed that air power alone could not win a war. Hitler had believed that terror from the sky would force Britain to its knees. Instead, it strengthened the nation's resolve and inspired resistance movements across occupied Europe. From the ashes of London, the world learned a lesson: courage is contagious. By 1942, the tide of war was slowly turning. The Soviet Union had joined the fight. The United States had entered the war after Pearl Harbor. The Allies were forming a united front, one that would eventually push back the darkness that had consumed Europe. And at the heart of that defiance stood the Blitz, the firestorm that had failed to break a people's will. When the war finally ended, leaders around the world credited Britain's endurance as the spark that kept hope alive in humanity's darkest hour. The Blitz was not just a British story, it was a human story. A story of how, when the world seems lost to fear, courage can light the way for all mankind. The Blitz ended more than 80 years ago, but its echoes still whisper through time. What began as a campaign of terror became one of humanity's greatest lessons in endurance, unity, and faith. The flames that consumed Britain's cities revealed not weakness, but unimaginable strength. The Blitz showed the world that courage does not wear a uniform. It wears the face of the ordinary. It is the mother holding her child in a shelter while bombs shake the ground. It is the fireman racing toward the flames when others run away. It is the teacher calming a room full of frightened children underground. In those moments, Britain discovered the power of its people. From that courage came lessons that the world must never forget. Lesson 1: fear can destroy buildings, but it cannot destroy spirit. The Luftwaffe dropped millions of tons of bombs, but they could not crush hope. Each morning after destruction, people swept their doorsteps, hung out their flags, and carried on. Lesson 2: unity is the greatest weapon of all. Class, wealth, and status disappeared in the shelters. Rich and poor shared the same floor, the same fear, the same determination to survive. Out of tragedy, a nation learned what it truly meant to stand together. Lesson 3: freedom demands sacrifice. The Blitz reminded the world that liberty is not given, it is defended. Thousands gave their lives so that generations after them could live in peace. Even today, when visitors walk through the streets of London, the past still speaks. In quiet churchyards, plaques bear the names of those who never saw the morning. The walls of rebuilt cathedrals still carry the marks of fire. The people who lived through it are fewer now, but their stories endure in diaries, letters, and fading photographs. In schools, children still learn about those nights, not just to remember the bombs, but to remember the bravery. The Blitz changed history. It proved that even when surrounded by destruction, humanity can rise above hate. It showed that light is never truly extinguished. It only waits for someone brave enough to carry it forward. As the narrator of history, time continues to turn its pages, but one truth remains unshaken. The human spirit, Churchill once said, is stronger than anything that can happen to it. And so, the story of the Blitz is not only about war, it's about who we become when the world falls apart. A warning, a memory, and above all a beacon for those who stood in the fire and did not fall. History bows its head in eternal gratitude. Though the bombs have long fallen silent, the echoes of the Blitz still live on in stone, in story, and in spirit. 80 years later, Britain still carries the memory of those dark nights, not as wounds, but as lessons. Every anniversary, candles flicker across London, Coventry, Liverpool, and countless other cities once scarred by fire. Bells ring, silence falls, and for a moment, the past breathes again. Elderly survivors share their memories of nights spent in the underground, of flames that painted the sky red, of friends lost and found. Their voices tremble, yet their eyes shine with pride. They know they were part of something greater than survival. They were part of history's most powerful testament to endurance. Museums across Britain preserve their legacy: gas masks, ration books, fire helmets, faded letters home. Each artifact whispers the same message: we endured and we rebuilt. The Blitz was meant to crush a nation. Instead, it revealed what could never be destroyed: the strength of the human heart. Even today, that spirit endures in the quiet resilience of ordinary life. Every rebuilt street, every memorial stone, every blooming garden where rubble once lay, all stand as living symbols of defiance. New generations walk through cities that once burned, often unaware of the courage that saved them. Yet, beneath every step they take lies the memory of those who refuse to give up. In modern London, the skyline gleams with glass and steel, but amid the towers, the silhouette of St. Paul's Cathedral still rises, the same dome that survived the inferno of 1940. It stands as it did then, unbroken, eternal. The phrase Blitz spirit has entered the English language, meaning courage in the face of overwhelming odds. It is spoken not just about war, but about every challenge that demands strength and unity. Whenever Britain faces hardship, whether through disaster, loss, or uncertainty, people still look back to those nights of fire and remember, we have been here before and we endure. Because the Blitz was never just about bombs. It was about belief. Belief that hope is stronger than fear, that unity is stronger than hate, and that even in the darkest hour, light will always find a way. As the generations who lived it slowly fade, it becomes our duty to remember them not as victims, but as victors. Their courage, their humor, their humanity, these are the true monuments of the Blitz. And as long as their story is told, the spirit of the Blitz will never die. It will live on in history, in hearts, and in every rising dawn over the land they refuse to let fall. History remembers the leaders, the soldiers, and the battles. But beneath the headlines were thousands of unsung heroes, ordinary people who did extraordinary things. During the Blitz, heroism didn't always come with medals. It came in whispers, in quiet acts of bravery, in the courage of those who simply refused to give up. There were the nurses, working through endless nights as hospitals shook from explosions. They tended to the wounded by candlelight, their hands steady even when the walls trembled. Many died where they stood, refusing to abandon their patients. There were the bus drivers and train conductors who kept the city moving through chaos, guiding people to safety, transporting supplies, never knowing if the next bomb would find them. There were the postmen who delivered letters through streets still smoldering from the night before. To the families who waited in silence, a letter meant hope, proof that a loved one still lived. There were the women of the Women's Voluntary Service who brewed tea for survivors, distributed blankets, and dug through rubble to save strangers. One volunteer later said, "We were scared, but we didn't have time to think about fear." And there were the ARP wardens who patrolled the streets during blackouts, shouting, "Put that light out," while bombs rained above. They risked their lives to keep others safe, ensuring no stray light betrayed the city to enemy planes. Even animals played their part. Dogs sniffed out survivors beneath debris. Pigeons carried vital messages when radio lines failed. In the smallest corners of war, bravery found its way. Then there were the factory workers, especially women, who kept the machinery of war turning while their cities burned. They built planes, weapons, and uniforms, working through nights filled with sirens, never stopping, because they knew the nation depended on them. Each of these people, though seldom named, formed the backbone of Britain's survival. They were the quiet heroes, the ones who held the line not with guns, but with grit. When the war was over, many returned to ordinary life. They didn't seek glory or gratitude, but without them, the story of the Blitz, and perhaps the story of victory, could never have been written. Their names may not appear in history books, but their deeds live on in every rebuilt home, every peaceful dawn, every generation that followed in freedom. Because true heroism isn't about recognition. It's about doing what must be done when no one is watching. And in the long shadow of war, it was these unsung heroes who kept the flame of hope alive. After 8 long months of terror, the night sky finally began to quiet. The last major raid of the Blitz came on May 10, 1941, a night that burned itself into history. German bombers unleashed one final storm upon London. For 7 relentless hours, the city was drenched in flame. More than 700 tons of bombs fell on homes, churches, hospitals, and landmarks. The House of Commons was destroyed. The British Museum was struck. And yet, amid the chaos, the people stood firm. Firefighters fought the infernos till dawn, water running low, exhaustion setting in. Londoners huddled in shelters, holding each other, whispering prayers. The roar above seemed endless. And then, as the sun rose, the sound began to fade. The Luftwaffe turned back. The last major raid was over. When morning came, London was in ruins once more. Smoke coiled over the skyline, and the smell of burning wood filled the air. Streets were buried in debris, and silence replaced the thunder. But this silence was different. It was not the silence of defeat. It was the silence of survival. For the first time in months, there was hope. Germany, now preparing for its invasion of the Soviet Union, shifted its bombers eastward. The Blitz was over, though few dared believe it at first. That night marked both an ending and a beginning, the end of Britain's darkest ordeal, and the beginning of its road to recovery. London had lost 43,000 souls, and nearly 1 million homes were destroyed. Yet the city still stood, scarred, but unbroken. St. Paul's Cathedral still towered above the ashes, its dome untouched, a symbol of defiance that captured the world's heart. In Churchill's words, "We can take it, we have proved it." And they had. From that day forward, the phrase, "London can take it," became immortal. It wasn't just about endurance, it was about identity, about a people who refused to yield, no matter the odds. The Blitz had not defeated Britain, it had forged it. And though the war was far from over, something inside the nation had changed forever. They had looked into the heart of darkness and found light. As dawn broke over the battered city, Londoners emerged from shelters and looked up at the sky, clear, silent, peaceful. For the first time in 267 days, the city was free from the bombs. The Blitz was over, but its spirit, the courage, the unity, the unbreakable will would live on for generations to come. When the bombs stopped falling, Britain awoke to a landscape of ashes. Entire neighborhoods had vanished. Streets that once rang with laughter were now silent fields of rubble. But among the ruins, the British spirit stirred again, in mourning, but in determination. Across London, Coventry, Plymouth, and dozens of shattered cities, people picked up bricks with bare hands. The rebuilding began not with governments, but with neighbors. Mothers swept the dust from shattered kitchens. Children planted flowers in bomb craters. Men returned from the shelters to find their homes gone, and still, they rebuilt. There was no waiting for miracles. The miracle was in the people themselves. The government launched the Reconstruction Program, aiming to restore not just buildings, but hope. Architect Sir Patrick Abercrombie envisioned a new London, one of parks, open spaces, and stronger homes. The war that had destroyed so much also became the seed for rebirth. From 1945 onward, cranes replaced the bombers in the sky. Factories once used for war now produced steel, cement, and dreams. Brick by brick, Britain rose again. Yet, rebuilding wasn't only physical, it was emotional. Families torn apart found ways to heal. Letters from soldiers returned home, and those who survived carried the stories of the fallen. The sound of laughter returned to the same streets where sirens once wailed. The Blitz had changed everything from architecture to attitude. Cities were redesigned to be safer, more open, more united. Communities that had shared cellars and shelters stayed close long after the war ended. The Blitz spirit evolved into the British resilience that would define the post-war generation. Prime Minister Clement Attlee's government introduced sweeping reforms, rebuilding homes, expanding public health care, and launching the National Health Service in 1948. It was as if the destruction had forced Britain to reimagine itself, to rebuild not only walls but values. In those years, something extraordinary happened. Hope became stronger than memory. Children born amid the rubble grew up in a world rebuilt from courage. They would become the generation that turned survival into strength. From the ashes of the Blitz, a new Britain emerged, modern, compassionate, and unbreakable. The skyline changed, but the spirit remained the same. For though the Blitz had taken lives, it could not take the will to live. And as the years passed, the ruins faded, replaced by schools, gardens, and laughter once more. The fire that had once destroyed the cities now burned only in memory, as a reminder of what humanity can endure, and what it can build again. The Blitz ended more than 8 decades ago, yet its spirit still walks the streets of Britain. In London's quiet corners, bronze plaques and marble memorials mark the places where bombs once fell. Children hurry past on their way to school, unaware that beneath their feet lie the echoes of war. Yet, every November, when the poppies bloom and the bells toll for remembrance, those echoes rise again, gentle, proud, and unforgotten. The Blitz spirit has become more than a phrase. It's a symbol of unity, a reminder that even when the night is darkest, people can stand together and endure. You can see it in the resilience of modern Britain, in communities that rally after disaster, in voices that refuse to be silenced by fear. The same strength that kept Londoners in their shelters now fuels the courage of generations facing new storms. Survivors of the Blitz often spoke of how it changed them forever. They had looked death in the face and discovered not despair, but determination. Many said that after the war, nothing could ever truly frighten them again. In the decades that followed, Britain rebuilt not only its cities, but its soul. The lessons of the Blitz became lessons for the world about endurance, compassion, and the unbreakable power of the human heart. Films, books, and documentaries keep their stories alive, capturing those flickers of courage that once lit the blacked-out nights. In classrooms, teachers tell their students about the nights when ordinary people became heroes, not for glory, but for one another. The Blitz taught a generation that courage isn't loud. Sometimes, it's the quiet decision to face another dawn, even after losing everything. And that spirit, that calm defiance, lives on in every act of kindness, every moment of solidarity, every refusal to give up. When the world once again faces darkness, whether through war, disaster, or fear, the memory of the Blitz whispers across time, stand firm, stay united. Hope will return, because the legacy of those nights isn't destruction, it's rebirth. It's the story of a nation that refused to kneel, and of a people who showed the world what resilience truly means. The Blitz may belong to history, but its spirit belongs to the future, to everyone who believes that courage and compassion will always outlast hate and fear. And so, as we close this chapter, we remember not the bombs, nor the flames, but the hearts that endured them. The lights that went out in 1940 shone again, and they still shine today. As London burned, the world watched, and the world changed. When the Blitz began in 1940, it wasn't just Britain that felt the tremors. Across the globe, nations watched as a small island stood alone against the might of Nazi Germany. The world's newspapers carried headlines of destruction, but also of courage. From New York to Sydney, people listened to the crackling radio broadcasts of Edward R. Murrow, the American journalist who reported live from London rooftops during the raids. His words carried the thunder of war across the Atlantic. This is London, and the lights are going out. For millions, those broadcasts transformed Britain's struggle into humanity's struggle. America, still officially neutral, began to see the Blitz not as a distant war, but as a moral battle between freedom and tyranny. Ordinary Americans organized aid campaigns, sending food, blankets, and medical supplies to British families. The famous Bundles for Britain movement gathered thousands of volunteers, proving that compassion could cross oceans. Even before joining the war, the United States began supporting Britain through the Lend-Lease Act, supplying vital ships, planes, and fuel. It was an unspoken message from across the sea: you are not alone. In Canada, Australia, India, and other parts of the Commonwealth, soldiers and citizens alike watched with pride and grief. The Blitz united them under a single flag of resilience. Many volunteered to fight, inspired by the courage of those who endured the bombing. The Blitz also reshaped how wars were understood. For the first time, civilians became targets on a massive scale. The world realized that modern warfare would no longer spare the innocent, and that victory would depend as much on the spirit of the people as on the strength of the army. Images of burning London reached far beyond Europe. They stirred empathy, outrage, and resolve. Across occupied Europe, resistance movements drew hope from Britain's stand. If London could survive, perhaps they could, too. And when Winston Churchill's speeches echoed through radio waves, his defiant voice booming with lines like, "We shall never surrender," they inspired millions who had never set foot on British soil. The Blitz was no longer just Britain's darkest hour. It had become the world's shared moment of awakening, a call to unite against the shadow spreading across continents. By the time the last bombs fell, the world knew the British people had faced the fire, and through their endurance, had reignited the flame of global hope. In Britain's darkest nights, when the city burned and the people trembled beneath the sirens, one voice rose above the chaos, calm, fierce, and unyielding. That voice belonged to Winston Churchill, the Prime Minister who became the embodiment of defiance. When he took office in May 1940, Britain stood on the edge of collapse. France was falling, Europe was lost, and Hitler's army seemed unstoppable. Yet Churchill's words became the nation's weapon, sharper than steel, stronger than fear. He didn't promise safety, he promised struggle. In his first speech to Parliament, he declared, "I have nothing to offer but blood, toil, tears, and sweat." Those words struck deep into the hearts of his people. They didn't ask for comfort, they asked for courage. When the bombs began to fall, Churchill visited the ruins himself. He walked through smoking streets, his cigar glowing faintly in the dust. Survivors gathered around him, some weeping, some silent, and he would simply bow his head, sharing their grief. Then, he would look up and say softly, "We shall rebuild, and we shall never surrender." His speeches became lifelines. Each time he spoke on the radio, the nation paused. Families in shelters huddled around crackling speakers, waiting to hear his voice. It was not just rhetoric, it was resolve. When the world expected despair, Churchill gave them fire. "We shall fight on the beaches. We shall fight on the landing grounds. We shall never surrender." His defiance echoed across the Atlantic, inspiring Franklin D. Roosevelt and convincing America that this was a battle worth joining. Even Hitler understood the power of Churchill's words, calling him the British Bulldog, a nickname meant as an insult but embraced as a badge of honor. Churchill understood something vital, that wars are not won only by weapons, but by willpower. As bombs fell and buildings burned, he gave the people a reason to stand, not because victory was certain, but because surrender was unthinkable. He once said, "Courage is rightly esteemed the first of human qualities, because it is the quality which guarantees all others." And through that courage, Britain endured. The Blitz tested every soul in the nation, yet Churchill's resolve became their armor. His speeches turned fear into fury, despair into defiance. When the smoke cleared and the fires died down, his voice still lingered, a reminder that even when the world seems lost, words can keep hope alive. In the end, Churchill didn't just lead Britain through the Blitz, he gave it a reason to believe it could survive. When the last sirens faded and the skies cleared, the war was not yet over, but a new battle had already begun. The battle to rebuild. The Blitz had changed Britain forever. Its cities lay in ruins, its people weary, but unbroken. Nearly every street bore scars, craters where homes once stood, shattered glass, glittering like ghosts of the past. But beneath the wreckage, something powerful was stirring. Renewal. From 1945 onward, Britain faced the colossal task of reconstruction. Millions were homeless, industries were crippled, the economy was drained by 6 years of war. Yet, amid the ashes, the same resilience that had carried the nation through the Blitz now drove it forward. Reconstruction wasn't just about rebuilding walls, it was about rebuilding lives. The government launched the Housing Act of 1946, promising affordable homes for families who had lost everything. Rows of prefab houses began to appear across the nation, simple, sturdy, and filled with hope. For many, it was the first warm bed they'd had in years. In cities like London, Coventry, and Liverpool, architects dreamed of a better future. They didn't want to restore the past, they wanted to create something new. Wider streets, green parks, modern schools, a cleaner, stronger Britain. The Blitz had revealed the cracks in society, and now, the people demanded change. From those demands came something remarkable: the birth of the welfare state. In 1948, the National Health Service was founded. Free healthcare for every citizen. It was more than policy, it was a promise that no one would ever face suffering alone again. The same unity that had held the country together under the bombs now shaped its peace. The war also forged a new Britain on the world stage, one that understood the value of alliances. The bonds built during the Blitz led to partnerships that would form the backbone of the United Nations and the NATO alliance, ensuring such darkness would never return unchecked. For those who lived through it, peace felt strange. The sound of silence, once a comfort, now seemed haunting. Many struggled with memories they could not forget: the smell of smoke, the cries in the night, the friends who never returned. Yet, even in grief, there was pride. The survivors of the Blitz carried one truth with them: they had faced hell and rebuilt heaven. They taught their children the lessons of courage, of unity, and of hope, lessons that would define generations. And so, as Britain rose from its ashes, it didn't just rebuild its cities, it rebuilt the very meaning of strength. Because in the end, the Blitz had not destroyed Britain, it had revealed what Britain truly was. When the smoke cleared and the fire faded, something far greater than the destruction remained: the rebirth of a nation. The Blitz had scarred Britain beyond recognition. Cities were torn apart, and families forever changed. Yet, amid the rubble, an invisible force bound the people together: unity. It was not forged in peace, but in pain. Not through victory, but through survival. The shared experience of the Blitz became a defining thread in Britain's national identity. No longer divided by class or status, rich and poor had stood shoulder to shoulder in the shelters. The aristocrat and the factory worker shared the same air, the same fear, and ultimately, the same courage. This unity gave birth to a new kind of Britain, one built on empathy and equality. The old world of privilege had burned away with the bombs, making space for something purer. As the country rebuilt, people began to see one another differently. The man who had once been a stranger in the next street was now a comrade, someone who had faced the same nights of terror, who had dug through the same rubble, who had carried the same loss. In Parliament, this unity transformed into policy. The people demanded more than just recovery, they demanded fairness. And so came the reforms that reshaped the nation: public housing, education for all, healthcare without cost, and a welfare system to protect every citizen. These were not gifts from leaders, they were promises made in the shelters, under the sound of falling bombs. Promises that said, if we survive this, we will build a better world together. The Blitz had proven that Britain's greatest strength was not in its military or its empire, but in its people. The courage of ordinary citizens had saved the nation when all else seemed lost. That realization changed everything. In the years after the war, as peace slowly settled over Europe, Britain became a symbol of endurance. Its skyline, once shrouded in smoke, now glistened with hope. Cities like London, Coventry, and Manchester rose from ashes, not identical to what they were, but stronger, wiser, and more united than before. For those who had lived through it, life would never be the same. But neither would Britain. The Blitz had given the nation a gift disguised as tragedy: the understanding that unity was its greatest weapon. Every rebuilt home, every reopened school, every laughter-filled street stood as proof that from destruction can come creation, and from fear can come faith. The bombs had aimed to divide and destroy, but they achieved the opposite. They forged one nation, divisible and unbreakable. And though the ruins were cleared long ago, the spirit that rose from them, the spirit of unity, courage, and compassion still defines Britain to this day. Long after the sirens fell silent, the echoes of the Blitz still live not in the skies, but in the hearts of those who survived. For millions of Britons, the end of the war did not mean the end of suffering. The nightmares lingered, the sound of explosions, the fear of darkness, the faces of loved ones lost. The Blitz had carved itself into memory, becoming a silent companion that followed its survivors through the rest of their lives. In the years after 1945, men and women tried to rebuild not just their homes, but their minds. Streets were reconstructed faster than spirits could heal. Many veterans of the home front rarely spoke about those nights, but when they did, their words carried the weight of the world. Old diaries tell their stories: a mother clutching her children as the house trembled, a firefighter racing through smoke to save strangers, a boy who lost his home, yet still went to school the next morning. Ordinary lives caught in extraordinary times. There were those who never recovered, widows who sat by empty chairs, children who grew up without parents, and families who returned to nothing but rubble. Yet, even in grief, they carried an unspoken pride. We endured. The Blitz left behind more than ruins. It left memories that shaped generations. Parents passed their stories to children, not as tales of horror, but as lessons in courage. We didn't give up, they'd say. We stood together. Some memories were etched in places rather than words. A cracked wall that still bore shrapnel scars. A street corner where a bomb once fell, now a garden filled with flowers. Every mark told a story, a reminder that the past still lived beneath the surface of the present. Historians later called these survivors the silent generation. But silence does not mean forgetfulness. For them, remembrance was sacred. Each year, as the nation observed its moment of silence, they closed their eyes and returned just for a moment to the shelters, the smoke, the sound of sirens. Yet within those memories was also resilience. The Blitz taught them to appreciate peace, to cherish the ordinary, the laughter of children, the sound of music, the calm of a starlit night free of bombers. Many survivors went on to build lives filled with love, community, and strength. They carried their memories like invisible medals, not for what they won, but for what they withstood. The story of the Blitz was not only about destruction, it was about the people who refused to be destroyed. Their stories became the soul of a nation, proof that even in the darkest night, the human spirit can shine the brightest. The fires of the Blitz may have been extinguished, but the light they created still burns, a beacon of courage that continues to guide generations. More than 80 years have passed since those nights of terror, yet the lessons of the Blitz remain timeless. In every challenge that Britain and the world faces today, echoes of that defiant spirit can still be heard. When disaster strikes, when uncertainty looms, people often look back and ask, how did they endure? The answer lies not in power, but in unity, not in weapons, but in will. The Blitz taught humanity that even when everything is taken away, homes, comfort, safety, hope can still survive. It is a message that transcends borders and generations. In times of crisis, whether war, disaster, or loss, the human heart finds strength and solidarity. Modern Britain still bears the fingerprints of that courage. The emergency services that protect its citizens, the community spirit that rises in times of hardship, all trace their roots to those nights when the nation stood as one. The Blitz spirit was never just about survival. It was about defiance, the refusal to surrender to fear. It taught the world that courage is not the absence of fear, but the triumph over it. That same spirit surfaced decades later during tragedies, pandemics, and global turmoil. Whenever ordinary people stood together, helping strangers, comforting neighbors, and rebuilding shattered lives, the phrase, "keep calm and carry on," was more than propaganda. It became a philosophy, quiet strength passed from generation to generation. But the legacy of the Blitz also reminds us of the cost of conflict. Behind every story of bravery lies the pain of loss. Behind every rebuilt building lies a family that once lived there. Remembering the Blitz is not about glorifying war, it's about honoring peace. In schools, museums, and memorials, the story is retold not as history alone, but as a warning, a reminder that war brings devastation, but humanity brings redemption. As the world changes, with new threats, new challenges, the courage of those who faced the Blitz remains a mirror for us all. It asks a question as relevant today as it was in 1940. When the darkness falls, will we stand together? The answer lies in the legacy left behind, a legacy written not in victory parades or medals, but in the hearts of ordinary people who chose compassion over despair. The Blitz ended, but its spirit endures in every act of kindness, in every moment of courage, in every life rebuilt from ruin. That is its true victory.